Well, I'm quite excited today because we've been invited into the home of Dr. Richard Blackaby, and together with his father, he co-authored the book Spiritual Leadership. Dr. Blackaby, it's a great privilege to be here today.
It's our delight to have you.
Yeah, that's our thrill. A couple of years ago, Dr. Blackaby, your dad, Henry, spoke at our international convention in Atlanta and spoke about spiritual leadership. And we're at a stage in the growth of our ministry and the development of our membership base to talk to them about spiritual leadership. So we're just so excited to be here and very privileged that you allowed us to come today and to visit your home, to be around all of these books and to sit and talk to you about spiritual leadership.
Well, thank you. To me, leadership is the key. God has worked throughout human history, but every time God wanted to do a great work, He always raised up a leader. And so as I look at what God is doing today, I know that's His pattern. And so I'm looking for those leaders He's going to raise up today and do mighty work through them, just like He's done through every generation.
Well, one of the blessings I've had so far today is I joined you and your dad at First Baptist in Jonesboro, and we went through Jeremiah 7 about leadership, and you shared with us some of the principles about what believers should do in terms of who to look for with regard to leadership. Maybe you want to share some of that information with us.
Well, as we saw with Jeremiah's life, he was young. He was not a good speaker, he thought. He wasn't polished. He didn't have the platform he thought was necessary to be an effective leader. But the one thing he did have was God. And with God, you always have enough. And when you're walking with Him, He gives you the words to say. And one of the things I've realized in my own life is people don't need my opinion. My opinion won't help anybody. My opinion won't set anybody free. But one word from God can forever transform a life. And so for me, any person can receive a word from God. Any servant can. And we don't even know to this day how eloquent Jeremiah was, but there's no question that the words that came out of his mouth had come from God. And so any Gideon, any person can receive a word from God and share it faithfully and see a life transformed as a result.
So where do we begin? I mean, if we're ordinary, do we just sit and wait for that miracle from God, or what can we do?
Well, I've been driven, and my father's been driven by the truth that if you're faithful in a little, God gives you more. So whenever anyone comes to me and says, well, what can I do? I'd say, well, be faithful in a little. Everybody has a little. Just start with that. Don't worry about the great, the much. Just be faithful in that one talent that God gave you. It might be one relationship. It might be raising your 2 children faithfully. It might be just reaching out in kindness to your next door neighbor, or just serving in whatever capacity God puts something in your hands to be faithful with. People have often asked my father how he ended up speaking in the White House or the Pentagon or the United Nations or other places. And if you trace his life, he would simply say, I was always faithful in a little. And
we heard that this morning.
Yeah, and that really is true. And that's what I learned from my dad was, don't worry about the great stuff. Don't fret about that. Just be faithful in what God put in your hand today. Did you get to the end of today and say, everything God wanted me to do today, I was faithful in? And if you do that every day, you're going to end up with a great life.
So we've talked a lot about the personal growth as a leader, how we begin, the things that we can do, some of the principles that we can introduce into our life. But now that we are a leader, people expect us to lead, and they expect us to set goals, achieve things. What are some of the principles that you've learnt over the years with regard to well, particularly in the Gideon ministry? Every year we reset our goals, every year we have objectives, every year we want to increase church presentations and scripture distribution, the money we raise, the recruitment of membership. What are some good principles in planning and developing strategies? I mean, they're business and professional men. They know how to fill out sticky notes and whiteboards and set plans. What really should they do?
Well, there's 2 key verses that for me have just driven what I do. The principle is simply this. Leaders are all driven by an agenda. We all have an agenda. The question is, where is that agenda coming from? And so Isaiah 55, verses 8 and 9, God says, no, my ways are not your ways. My thoughts are not your thoughts. As high as the heavens are from the earth, that's the distance between your thinking and my thinking. The other verse that in the New Testament that I think parallels that is Ephesians 3:20, where Paul's writing, he says, now the Christ, he's the one who's able to do exceedingly abundantly, beyond anything you could ever ask or even think to ask. You couldn't imagine it. So, you lay that over your planning and your thinking and say, okay, so when I look at the agenda for my ministry in my life, the goals I'm setting, was that my best thinking? Did I sit down and see, a lot of Christians, they think that if they pray first, then when they do all their own human thinking afterward, that somehow it's honoring to God. Or I've heard people say, well, you just need to set goals big enough that they honor God. God's not honored by small goals, so set a big goal. And my question is, well, how big would your goal have to be before you could impress God? Where God could look at your planning and say, now that's a guy, I'm really impressed with the way he thinks. God's not going to do that. So what I've been convicted about is this: I can come up with the best thinking that I possibly could come up with, but I may rob you if all I give you is my best. Because what you really need is God's best. And I've been convicted I can't give you my best and God's best at the same time.
So every year our camps across America, around the world, around about June every year, they sit down and they set their goals for the next year. And I'm sure that they look at past year's performance. They look at potential in their camp territory, how many churches, how many hotels, how many schools, how many students. They look at their membership base. And I imagine they sit down and they open in prayer.
And probably close in prayer.
And probably close in prayer. They bookend it with prayer. What would be a good approach? Maybe a transformational approach.
Well, I would say let God be a part of the whole process, not the opening and closing prayer. See, sometimes we'll refer more to what we did last year than we'll refer to God. We'll reference our activity more than we reference the activity of God. And what you really want to be involved with is God's activity, not your effort.
Yeah.
So to say, so one thing I've learned is, if you ask the wrong question, you get the wrong answer. So if you sit with your team and say, what do you think we should do for next year? You've just asked the wrong question. If you say, what do you think our goal should be? And we start brainstorming our ideas, you've just generated all the wrong answers. The right question would be, what do you sense God is doing this year? What do you sense God wants to accomplish? Where do you sense God is at work around us in our ministry? Where do you think we need to adjust our activity to the activity of God? And keep your whole discussion God-centered from the very beginning. If you find yourself talking more about your budget than God, or about what you did last year than God, or what you think instead of what God thinks, you're a person-centered leader instead of a God-centered leader. One other thing I'd say is, if you're going to have an hour-long planning time, and you bookended it with prayer, and the 55 minutes in between was all of your discussion, ask yourself, what if you really want to be on God's agenda, shouldn't you let Him have time to speak? And so if in your 55 minutes or 60 minutes of setting your goals, you talk to God for a few minutes in prayer, and then you did all the planning, and so what confidence would you have God had any input in that? And
so is it almost fair to say that spiritual leadership is almost contrarian?
In many ways it is. Because if the last are going to be first, if the least are going to be the greatest, you don't come to be served, but to serve. You're not going to find that. The world doesn't promote that, and so it'll be counterintuitive to you. So depending on when you became a Christian or how you were discipled, you underestimate how much you've been soaking in the way the world does things. But it has permeated your mind and your heart, even the things you really care about, like credit and success and
insurance,
gratitude and insurance and security, and that's just not promised in the Gospels. It's telling you if you look for the credit, then you've gotten your reward in full. And I find a lot of people that'll, it's the old saying, I don't mind being a servant, I just hate being treated like one. And for a lot of us, we don't mind the title of being a servant, but then people start treating us like one, or they don't thank us, they don't give us credit, we don't get a promotion or whatever else, and our hearts begin to speak and say, well, but you deserve that, look how hard you worked. And to be a spiritual leader says, God, just free me from the way the world values things and does things, and let me be like your son.
You know, that's a really interesting concept, because many of us, as we want to grow and learn to be better leaders, particularly spiritual leaders, are always looking at the next new thing that we need to acquire.
Yeah.
But in fact, what you're telling us, there are some things in our lives that are stumbling blocks that we need to give up.
Exactly. And what happens over time is you've been to all these seminars and read all these books. You've got such a mess and a congestion of things you've added to your life, but you've never let the Spirit of God remove anything. And so you've got a traffic jam now of all these competing different things you're supposed to be doing, and you don't know what to do next. And I find the Spirit of God has a way of simplifying and saying, well, let's just get rid of this stuff. Let's get rid of that. That attitude just keeps tripping you up. And that issue with your mouth, you got to get rid of that. And that pride's got to go. And when you clear stuff out, suddenly you just can't imagine the freedom you have just to move forward with God and the next thing He has for your life.
That's wonderful. And so one of the key principles to grow as a spiritual leader is actually to crucify some things in your life, which basically means change.
Yeah, exactly.
So in terms of leadership, it's a great principle for a normal Christian, but even so, a stronger responsibility for those in spiritual leadership to be consistently in God's Word.
Well, certainly, because leaders are people of influence. Leaders are people who change things and make things better. And to do that, you need God to be guiding you, because only He can do that. So as a leader, it's impossible for you to do your job properly unless God has His hand upon your life and you know His truth, and what you're sharing has come from God.
So watching this video will be many of our Gideon auxiliary members across the country. Some have positions of leadership. You mentioned influence. You don't necessarily have to have a position to be a leader.
No, and you know, I've been a leader all my life. I've been around some great leaders. And when you get around a great leader, you know, you could be in a room with people and this person speaks and everybody listens. This person suggests an opinion, everybody, they may not even be the head of anything. They may not even hold an office, but you just know who it is who's speaking. You need to listen to them. But real leadership means it's who you are. You're a person of influence. When people hear you speak, they know you've been with God. When you give counsel, they recognize the wisdom of God coming out of your mouth. They look at your life and they see a track record of God's hand and blessing upon what you've done. And I don't care I don't even need to know what your job is. When I get around a person like that, I know I'm in the presence of a leader, a person I need to pay attention to. And my prayer for people is, don't try to find an office so you can be a leader. Let God work in your life, and you'll be a person of influence regardless of the position you hold.
And so it goes back to that principle you were talking earlier about being faithful in the little things.
Yeah. And over time, you have a track record of having been faithful consistently and God blessing what you did. And I find anybody who's faithfully done whatever God told them to do, I give them my attention. I want to hear what they have to say.
All right, so Dr. Blackaby, it's been a pleasure to be invited into your home today. On behalf of 300,000 men and women around the world, 3,100 camps across the USA, we're blessed by what God has done in your life. We're very grateful for your obedience to the Lord's call on your life, and thank you for your time, and we appreciate everything that you've done for the Lord and for the impact that you'll make in the Gideons International in the years ahead by encouraging us to be spiritual leaders.
Well, thank you. It's great to be with you.
God bless you.